They thought he was just another frail old man holding up the line, a small inconvenience in a busy airport, and when the crew quietly decided to deny him access to the flight he had rightfully paid for, they had no idea the true owner of the airline was standing just a few feet away watching every second unfold. Walter Hayes shuffled slowly toward Gate C-17 at Denver International Airport, his cane tapping softly against the polished floor as streams of hurried travelers flowed around him like water around a stone, his faded olive military jacket hanging loosely on his thin frame, the medals pinned to his chest catching the bright terminal lights, his silver hair neatly combed beneath an old veteran's cap, and though his shoulders were slightly hunched with age, his posture still carried a quiet dignity that time had not managed to steal. He wasn't traveling for pleasure. The trip to Charleston was for a small ceremony honoring the last surviving members of his Korean War unit, a reunion that grew smaller each year as more names were remembered in silence rather than in person, and Walter had debated whether the long journey was worth the strain on his body, but decided that showing up mattered because loyalty didn't fade with age. At the gate counter, a young attendant named Brittany stood reviewing boarding passes with mechanical efficiency, her bright scarf perfectly arranged and her professional smile practiced and polished, but when Walter handed her his ticket her expression flickered ever so slightly before returning to its customer service neutrality, and she scanned the pass once, then again, her fingers tapping impatiently against the keyboard. "Sir," she began in a tone that sounded polite but carried an edge of inconvenience, "this seat has already been reassigned." Walter frowned gently, lines deepening across his weathered face. "That can't be right, miss. I purchased it over a month ago." Brittany gave a tight nod while glancing over his shoulder at the growing line. "It appears the flight has been oversold. We're asking for volunteers to move to a later departure. And since you haven't boarded yet, we can rebook you for tomorrow." A ripple of impatience moved through the passengers behind him. Someone sighed loudly, another checked their watch. Walter shifted his weight on his cane. "Tomorrow won't work," he said quietly. "I need to be there tonight." Brittany's smile thinned. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's nothing I can do." A few steps away, leaning casually against a column and dressed in a simple gray hoodie and jeans, Ethan Caldwell watched the exchange without drawing attention to himself. To anyone else, he looked like another traveler waiting to board, but Ethan was in fact the CEO and majority owner of Skybridge Airways, and he had made a habit of flying anonymously to observe how his airline treated passengers when no executive titles were present to influence behavior. His eyes narrowed slightly as he saw Brittany lean toward a coworker and whisper something that made them both glance dismissively in Walter's direction. And though Ethan couldn't hear every word, he caught enough. Probably confused. Easier to move him. He won't make a fuss. To feel a tightening in his chest. Walter remained calm, stepping aside as instructed while other passengers boarded, his cane trembling faintly in his grip, not from anger, but from the strain of standing too long. And Ethan noted how no one offered him a seat while he waited, how the crew avoided eye contact, how efficiency seemed to matter more than fairness. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and when Brittany finally returned, her voice had lost even the pretense of warmth. "Mr. Hayes, we can put you in the last available seat, but it's in the rear of the aircraft next to the lavatory. That's the only option." Walter exhaled softly, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face before he nodded. "That'll do." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. Overbooking was the airline's responsibility, not the passenger's burden, and yet here was a man who had served his country accepting a downgrade without complaint just to avoid causing trouble. Ethan stepped forward at last. "Excuse me," he said evenly. "He has a confirmed ticket, doesn't he?" Brittany stiffened. "Yes, but adjustments had to be made." "Adjustments because of the airline's error," Ethan replied calmly. Walter placed a gentle hand on Ethan's arm. "It's all right, son. No need to stir things up." But Ethan wasn't finished observing. He wanted to see how far this would go without intervention. As Walter slowly made his way down the jet bridge, passengers brushing past him, Ethan followed at a distance, his mind racing with a mixture of anger and resolve. Inside the cabin, the narrow aisle forced Walter to turn sideways to avoid bumping seated travelers. And when he finally reached the back row near the restroom, the faint odor and constant foot traffic made it clear this was the least desirable seat on the plane. He lowered himself carefully into it, placing his small duffel bag at his feet, his metals glinting faintly under the dim cabin lights. And though he closed his eyes as if resting, Ethan could see the subtle tightening of his jaw that betrayed the humiliation he refused to voice. The engines roared to life, announcements crackled overhead, and flight attendants moved briskly through the aisle without acknowledging the elderly veteran seated beside the lavatory door, and Ethan returned to his assigned seat several rows ahead, his expression unreadable but his thoughts burning with clarity. This was exactly why he flew undercover, to witness the unfiltered truth. And what he had just seen was not merely a logistical oversight, but a cultural failure, a quiet dismissal of dignity in favor of convenience. As the aircraft lifted into the sky above Denver's sprawling lights, Ethan made a silent promise that by the time this journey ended, things at Skybridge Airways would not remain the same, because the crew might have seen Walter Hayes as an inconvenience, but Ethan had seen something entirely different, a test of character that his airline had just failed. The crew believed the situation had ended once the plane reached cruising altitude, but they didn't realize the real story was only beginning in the last row beside the restroom. About 20 minutes into the flight, Ethan Caldwell unbuckled his seatbelt and casually walked toward the back of the cabin. Walter Hayes sat quietly where they had placed him, hands folded over his worn duffel bag, his posture straight despite the cramped space and steady foot traffic. Ethan paused beside the empty seat next to him. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" he asked. Walter gave a small nod. "Don't mind at all." As they spoke briefly about the ceremony Walter was traveling to attend, a slight bump in the air shifted the duffel bag at his feet. Something metallic slid out and tapped against the floor. Ethan bent to pick it up and felt his breath catch. It was a Distinguished Service Cross. The name engraved on the back read, Walter Hayes. Ethan stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. He had seen that medal before. Not this one, but one exactly like it, displayed in a wooden case in his grandfather's study. Growing up, he had heard the story countless times about a soldier who had dragged a wounded man through enemy fire during the winter of 1951. A man who had taken command when others fell and held his position long enough to save what remained of his unit. "My grandfather used to talk about someone named Walter Hayes," Ethan said carefully, handing the medal back. "Said he wouldn't have made it home without him." Walter's eyes sharpened. "James Caldwell." Ethan felt a chill. "Yes, sir. That was my grandfather." Silence lingered between them, thick with recognition. Walter leaned back slightly. "James was a good man. Brave. Loyal. He always said you were the brave one," Ethan replied. Walter gave a faint shake of his head. "You don't think about bravery in moments like that. You just move." In a steady, humble voice, Walter recounted the ambush, how their unit had been caught in freezing conditions near the 38th parallel, how James had been wounded, and how there had been no time to hesitate. He had pulled him through snow and gunfire, step by painful step. Later, when their commanding officer was killed, Walter had taken charge and held their line until reinforcements arrived. "We lost a lot of men," Walter said quietly. "That's what stays with you, not the medal." Ethan listened in silence, absorbing every word. The man his airline had treated as an inconvenience was the reason his grandfather had survived to build the family business that would one day become Skybridge Airways. A flight attendant approached, her voice clipped. "Sir, you'll need to return to your assigned seat." Ethan stood calmly. "Of course." Walter offered him a small smile. "No need to stir trouble, son." But Ethan's mind was already racing as he walked back up the aisle. This wasn't just a boarding issue anymore. It wasn't just about policy or overbooking. The very foundation of his company traced back to the quiet hero sitting beside the lavatory door. When the captain announced their descent, Ethan returned briefly to Walter's seat and crouched beside him. "When we land," he said softly, "can I buy you a cup of coffee?" Walter studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." The crew believed they had handled a minor inconvenience before takeoff. They had no idea the airline's owner had just uncovered a debt decades in the making, and that by the time the plane touched down, everything was about to change. By the time the plane landed in Charleston, Ethan Caldwell had already made his decision. The crew went through their usual arrival routine, thanking passengers as they exited, unaware that the quiet man in the gray hoodie lingering near the back wasn't just another traveler finishing his journey. Walter Hayes rose slowly from his seat beside the restroom, steadying himself with his cane as passengers hurried past him without much notice. Ethan waited until the aisle cleared, then gently took Walter's duffel bag. "Coffee first," he said with a small smile. Walter nodded. Inside a quiet airport cafe, away from the noise of baggage claim, Ethan finally spoke plainly. "Mr. Hayes, there's something I need to tell you." Walter looked up calmly. "Go on." Ethan took a breath. "I wasn't just a passenger on that flight. I'm the owner of Skybridge Airways." Walter blinked in surprise, but didn't react with anger or accusation. He simply studied Ethan's face. "And what happened at the gate?" Ethan continued, his voice firm. "Should never have happened. Not to you. Not to anyone." Walter gave a slow nod. "Son, I've lived long enough to know people make mistakes." "Yes," Ethan replied. "But leadership is responsible for fixing them." 1 week later, every gate agent and flight attendant at the Denver hub received a mandatory meeting notice. Brittany walked into the conference room expecting a routine policy update. Instead, she froze when she saw Walter Hayes seated at the front of the room. Ethan stood beside him. No hoodie this time, no disguise, just authority. "Last week," Ethan began, his voice calm but commanding, "a passenger with a confirmed ticket was nearly denied boarding because of our overbooking error. That alone is unacceptable. But what concerns me more is how easily we dismissed him." The room was silent. "You didn't know who Mr. Hayes was," Ethan continued. "But that's exactly the point. Respect shouldn't depend on recognition." Brittany's face paled as realization settled in. She remembered the impatience in her tone, the whispered assumptions, the decision to move him because he wouldn't cause trouble. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This airline was built on integrity," he said. "And integrity is how we treat people when we think no one important is watching." His gaze swept the room. "I was watching." A heavy silence followed. Walter slowly stood, leaning on his cane. "We all have bad days," he said gently. "What matters is whether we learn from them." Brittany swallowed hard and stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, I'm truly sorry. I should have handled it differently." Walter nodded kindly. "Then handle it differently next time." That day, Ethan announced immediate changes across Skybridge Airways. Protected seating for elderly passengers, guaranteed accommodations for veterans, and mandatory service training focused on dignity and accountability. Overbooking policies were restructured. Escalation procedures were clarified. Most importantly, a new cultural expectation was made clear: no passenger would ever be treated as expendable again. But Ethan had one more surprise. 2 months later, in a small ceremony at the Skybridge hangar, employees gathered once more. Walter stood near the front, unaware of what was about to happen. As a large fabric covering was pulled away, a newly painted aircraft was revealed. Along its fuselage were the words, "Walter Hayes, a legacy of courage." Walter's eyes filled with emotion. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured. "Yes," Ethan said quietly, "I did. Because this wasn't just about honoring one veteran. It was about restoring something that had almost been lost: perspective." As the aircraft lifted into the sky on its inaugural flight, Walter watched from the runway viewing area, his name soaring higher with every passing second. He had never sought recognition. He had never demanded respect. But he had earned it long ago. And the crew who once saw him as an inconvenience would never forget the day they learned who had truly been watching.